The Castle by Franz Kafka. Chapter 14. I am your narrator. At long last, late in the afternoon, when it was already dark, Kay had cleared the garden path, piled the snow high on either side, beaten it down hard, and so accomplished his work for the day. He was standing by the garden gate in the middle of a wide solitude. He had driven off the remaining assistant hours before and chased him a long way, but the fellow had managed to hide himself somewhere between the garden and the schoolhouse and could not be found, nor had he shown himself since. Frida was indoors, either starting to wash clothes or still washing Giza's cat. It was a sign of great confidence on Giza's part that this task had been entrusted to Frida. An unpleasant and uncalled for task indeed, which Kay would not have suffered her to attempt had it not been advisable, in view of their various shortcomings, to seize every opportunity of securing Giza's goodwill. Giza had looked on approvingly while Kay brought down the little children's bath from the garret, heated water, and finally helped to put the cat carefully in the bath. Then she actually left the cat entirely in charge of Frida, for Schwarzer, Kay's acquaintance of the first evening, had arrived, had greeted Kay with a mixture of embarrassment arising out of the events of that evening, and of unmitigated contempt, such as one accords to a debtor, and had vanished with Giza in the other schoolroom. The two of them were still there. Schwarzer, Kay had been told in the Bridge Inn, had been living in the village for some time. Although he was a Castellan's son, because of his love for Giza, and through his influential connections, had got himself appointed as a pupil teacher, a position which he filled chiefly by attending all Giza's classes, either sitting on a school bench among the children, or preferably at Giza's feet on the teacher's dais. His presence was no longer a disturbance. The children had got quite used to it, all the more easily, perhaps, because Schwarzer neither liked nor understood children, and rarely spoke to them except when he took over the gymnastic lesson from Giza, and was content merely to breathe the same air as Giza and bask in her warmth and nearness. The only astonishing thing about it was that in the Bridge Inn, at least Schwarzer was spoken of with a certain degree of respect, even if his actions were ridiculous rather than praiseworthy, and that Giza was included in this respectful atmosphere. It was nonetheless unwarranted of Schwarzer to assume that his position as pupil teacher gave him a great superiority over Kay, for this superiority was non-existent. A school janitor was an important person to the rest of the staff, and should have been especially so to such an assistant as Schwarzer, a person not to be lightly despised, who should at least be suitably conciliated if professional considerations were not enough to prevent one from despising him. Kay decided to keep this fact in mind. Also that Schwarzer was still in his debt on account of their first evening, a debt which had not been lessened by the way in which events of succeeding days had seemed to justify Schwarzer's reception of him. For it must not be forgotten that this reception had perhaps determined the later course of events. Because of Schwarzer, the full attention of the authorities had been most unreasonably directed to K at the very first hour of his arrival, while he was still a complete stranger in the village, without a single acquaintance or an alternative shelter. Overtired with walking, as he was, and quite helpless on his sack of straw, he had been at the mercy of any official action. One night later might have made all the difference. Things might have gone quietly and been only half noticed. At any rate, nobody would have known anything about him or have had any suspicions. There would have been no hesitation in accepting him, at least for one day, as a stray wanderer. His handiness and trustworthiness would have been recognized and spoken of in the neighborhood, and probably he would have soon found accommodation somewhere as a servant. Of course, the authorities would have found him out, but there would have been a big difference between having the Central Bureau or whoever was on the telephone disturbed on his account in the middle of the night by an insistent, although ostensibly humble request for an immediate decision made, too, by Schwarzer, who was probably not in the best odor up there, and a quiet visit by K to the superintendent on the next day during official hours to report himself in proper form as a wandering stranger who had already found quarters in a respectable house and who would probably be leaving the place in another day's time, unless the unlikely were to happen and he found some work in the village only for a day or two, of course, since he did not mean to stay longer. That, or something like that, was what would have happened had it not been for Schwarzer. The authorities would have pursued the matter further, but calmly in the ordinary course of business, unharassed by what they probably hated most, the impatience of a waiting client. Well, all that was not Kay's fault. It was Schwarzer's fault. But Schwarzer was the son of a Castellan and had behaved with outward propriety, and so the matter could only be visited on Kay's head. And what was the trivial cause of it all? Perhaps an ungracious mood of geezers that day, which made Schwarzer roam sleeplessly all night and vent his annoyance on Kay. Of course, on the other hand, one could argue that Schwarzer's attitude was something Kay had to be thankful for. It had been the sole precipient of a situation Kay would never by himself have achieved, nor have dared to achieve, and which the authorities themselves would hardly have allowed, namely that from the very beginning, without any dissimulation, he found himself confronting the authorities face to face, insofar as that was at all possible. Still, that was a dubious gift. It spared Kay, indeed the necessity of lying and contriving, but it made him almost defenseless, handicapped him anyhow in the struggle, and might have driven him to despair had he not been able to remind himself that the difference in strength between the authorities and himself was so enormous that all the guile of which he was capable would hardly have served appreciably to reduce the difference in his favour. Yet that was only a reflection for his own consolation. Schwarzer was none the less in his debt, and having harmed K, then could be called upon now to help K, would be in need of help in the quite trivial and tentative opening moves, for Barnabas seemed to have failed him once again.